Alright YouTube, so we're back of course talking about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we are back with a topic that I didn't know if we'd ever be revisiting, and it's the Final Fantasy VII and 10 connection theory. Which of course these days isn't even really a theory, it's been confirmed by multiple devs, and of course with the Easter egg they put into Remake, it pretty much connects both games. We're not going to go super in depth on the theory within this video, but if you want to know more about it, I recommend checking out the video I just showed. It'll be linked in the description below. We go super in depth and cover everything that connects these games. Some of the stuff that connects both games are like the Fireflies in 10 and the Livestream in 7 being the same substance, the Promised Land in 7 and the Far Plane in 10 being relatively the same location where the dead go. But clearly the biggest connection between both games was the actual character of Shinra within Final Fantasy X-2, who's trying to harness the energy within the planet, which is literally what Shinra is doing within Final Fantasy VII. That's sort of like the quick bullet points of the theory, and then you fast forward to 2020 with Final Fantasy VII Remake, and you go into the Shinra building with the Shinra Museum, and you see this Easter egg where there's a character within this picture wearing an Al Bhed mask, much like the Shinra character from X-2. But why we're here today is I came across an article discussing this theory and how, when it comes to Remake Part 2, they should lean more into the connection. One connection this article points out that I've not seen before, I don't know if they came up with it or got it from somebody else's theory, but it was the connection between the Cetra and Genova and the Summoners and Sin. Both games have a similar story with their history. You have the ancient city of Zanarkand and the final summoning, the final Aeon, that temporarily defeats Sin. And then, of course, when it comes to Final Fantasy VII, you have the Cetra and Genova, who most of them were wiped out by Genova, and they launched a final attack to seal her away, again, not defeat her, temporarily defeat her, much like Sin. They're both sacrificial acts to temporarily get rid of the big evil trying to destroy the planet. Now, it's not a super concrete connection, but it's very similar. Plus, you have the connection with, like, the Cetra traveling the planet, and you also have the Summoners within 10 going on a pilgrimage, which is traveling the planet. And also something I thought of while making this video that wasn't actually my original thought necessarily, because people have already talked about it online, but it's the possibility of Genova being a Sin spawn. Now, people in this particular forum post are in disagreement, and the reasons are, like, the timelines being vastly different, being too far into the future, and Sin being defeated, but they are clearly mistaken. For starters, Genova crash landed on the planet about 2,000 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII. The way this connection theory works is that about 1,000 years after the events of X-2, Shinra's descendants traveled to Gaia and created the Shinra Power Company, Midgar, all that shit. So what this would mean in terms of the timeline is Genova crash landed on Gaia like 1,000 years before the events of Final Fantasy X, before Tidus and Yuna and everybody would have defeated Sin and started the Eternal Calm. But even if for some reason you want to put aside the timeline and put aside the defeat of Sin, it's all irrelevant anyways, because with Final Fantasy X we know that Sin comes back, which tells me these people don't really know what they're talking about. Sin is never permanently defeated, and that's where we're left off with when it comes to the Final Fantasy X story and timeline. Sin's back at the end of this story, and we've never had a continuation since. And if you want to dive even deeper down this rabbit hole, when it came to the first final Aeon, Yunalesca and her husband defeating Sin 1,000 years ago in Zanarkand, that adds up exactly with when Genova would have crash landed on Gaia, 1,000 years before the events of Final Fantasy X. So you can make the argument that 1,000 years ago, Lord Zayon and Yunalesca are using the final Aeon to defeat Sin for the first time, something that has never happened before, something that he's not used to, and fearing for its existence could have launched a piece of itself into space that was Genova that eventually landed on Gaia. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the origin of Genova, she fell down to Gaia from outer space. She had to come from somewhere. And to be clear, I'm not saying this is what happened, I'm not saying that this is canon. It's pure speculation, it's pure theory, but it's pretty interesting, and they can make it work if they wanted to. Now, we sort of went off on a tangent there, that wasn't even the point of this video, but as I kept recording and researching and finding more things and more evidence that kind of links these two games together, we had to talk about it. We haven't talked about this theory in a while anyways. Now, the point of this video, in reference to the article I mentioned earlier, was supposed to be talking about, Part 2 and going forward, if there's going to be any more references to Final Fantasy X. Now, some of the stuff they talk about doesn't make sense, like how they point out that, the Far Plane and the Livestream are similar, which would then potentially mean that we could get references to, like, Final Fantasy X characters within the Livestream, but the energies aren't the same. And what I mean by that is that both of these games take place on completely different planets. Spira takes place on World 1, Gaia takes place on World 2. So somebody dying within Final Fantasy X, getting sent to the Far Plane, their energy becoming part of the planet, wouldn't have effect on the Livestream in Final Fantasy VII because it's not even the same world. Now, the other idea they have is the summons within 7 and the Aeons within 10. This one is actually, within the lore anyways, is possible. In Final Fantasy X, you have the spheres, which are made up of Fireflies, which again, remember, the Fireflies are the same substance as Mako, and they're turning that into a usable form, much like materia within Final Fantasy VII, which is made up of Mako. They turn it into a crystallized form that's usable. And when it comes to Final Fantasy X, these summons are made up of a bunch of Fireflies, so they're essentially made of Mako. So what they'd have to do is take the Fireflies that make up the Aeons, turn it into a sphere, bring the sphere over to Gaia, and turn that energy into a summoned materia. Now, it's convoluted as hell, but within the lore of these games, within the science of these two games, it's something that is entirely possible. That being said, Final Fantasy VII does already have a pretty large pool of summons to use, but there's some that I can live without. Like, if you want to cut Kajata, that warthog summon thing, I don't know what the hell the damn thing is, and replace it with, like, Anima, for example, I'm not going to complain. Now, I am a bit biased because Anima is my favorite summon of all time, but she's also vastly cooler than a pig. Now, all that stuff aside, my thoughts on future remake games giving reference to Final Fantasy X, I don't know that I want anything concrete like, the live stream giving us an image of Yuna or talking about Yuna or some shit. That's just a little too on the nose for me, but I wouldn't mind more history of Shinra, like Shinra's descendants traveling to the planet and creating the Shinra company and building up Midgar and all that shit. I wouldn't mind more lore like that. And something I just thought about while recording this part is the theory goes that Shinra's descendants traveled from Spira to Gaia like 1,000 years ago, right? Well, there's a translation that I don't know if we ever got a concrete answer on, where it could be interpreted that the Cetra could either travel the land, as in the land of Gaia, or they travel from planet to planet. But if it's interpreted that they travel from planet to planet, you could make the conversation that the Cetra were the people that traveled from Spira. Again, that's assuming that they travel from planet to planet. But that would also mean that President Shinra would be a Cetra, and that's a whole nother rabbit hole, a whole nother video. My thing is, too, man, Final Fantasy VII's been out for over 20 years at this point, and when it comes to the Cetra, when it comes to Genova, and a lot of the other stuff we discussed in this video, we almost know nothing about that stuff. They've never really given us history on the Ancients or Genova, or where they came from, whatever. And this theory, which they've more or less made canon, a lot of stuff we talked about in this video, answers a lot of those questions. Like, if they wanted to create an origin for Genova, where does she come from? You could say she's a Sen spawn from Spira. She traveled through space, eventually landed on Gaia. You want to talk about where the Cetra came from, assuming they migrate from planet to planet, well, they're the people that came from Spira. I'm not saying those are the best explanations, I'm just saying those are ways that they could answer those questions if they wanted to. Ultimately, when it comes to Remake, I just want more history on the Ancients and Genova. That's something I want. Whether it's connected to Final Fantasy X or not, it doesn't have to be, I don't really care about that. I just want to know more about the lore of this world. And my whole thing with this topic is, over 17 years ago with Final Fantasy X-2, the devs themselves originated this theory by putting the character of Shinra into the game. And after X-2 released, there was multiple Final Fantasy VII related video games that were released, but never really had a reference to Final Fantasy X, outside of the airship in Dirge of Cerberus, the Shara, that may or may not be from Spira. And here we are 17 years later after Final Fantasy X-2 released, and they finally decided to connect both games, both worlds, with Remake. And it makes you wonder if going forward with Part 2 and beyond, if they're going to do any more references to Final Fantasy X. And that's really the overall point of this video, even though we dove into some more connection theories. Do you think that's going to happen? And the only way I can realistically see, without getting too crazy with the connection and breaking lore and all that other shit, would be delving a little more into Shinra's history with his family and creating the company. But that's pretty much the video, my dudes. I want to pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts on going forward with Part 2 and possibly beyond? We don't know how many games there's going to be. Do you think there's going to be any more connections to Final Fantasy X? Because realistically, as much as I wanted it when we first talked about this theory, I didn't think there was going to be anything with Remake, and I'll be damned if they didn't put that in there. So going forward with Remake, they might go full-on connection and give us some major references to Spira and 10 and stuff. Who knows? Anyways, I'm starting to lose my voice. I've been working on this video for quite a long time now. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys already want to stay updated with more Final Fantasy VII, Remake, and 10 connection theory stuff. Turn on my notifications. Follow me on Twitter at @dashingdavid. And my Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description. And in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain or leave it like Cobain.